och mycket välkomna till denna veckas upplaga av Veckomagasinet. Vi kommer prata om ett högaktuellt ämne som splittrar ekonomer, politiker och allmänhet över hela världen. Åtstramningspolitiken. Bredvid mig i studion har jag en synnerligen lämplig gäst, Thomas Herndon, studenten som i april i år sänkte den mest inflytelserika åtstramningsteorin. Welcome to Sweden, Mr. Herndon.
Thanks for having me.
You've had quite a year.
It's true. That's true.
Men vi börjar med att friska upp minnet med vad det var som egentligen hände i april i år.
Thomas Herndon är en 28-årig doktorand från Texas som sänkte den mest inflytelserika ekonomiska teorin sedan finanskrisens början. Hans experiment anses ha bidragit till att regeringar och centralbanker ändrat policies och backat från tuffa åtstramningskrav. Vi tar det från början. Det var Harvard-ekonomerna Rogoffs och Reinhart som drog i rapporten Growth in Time of Debt slutsatsen att länder får stora problem med tillväxten vid stor skuldsättning. Det fanns inga tydliga tecken på försämrad tillväxt vid skuldnivåer under 90% av BNP, men över den nivån skedde en dramatisk inbromsning. Rapporten fick ett enormt genomslag. Den gav politikerna som ville pressa ner budgetunderskotten ett stort övertag framför de som ville införa stimulans. Och den bidrog till nedskärningar i välfärden i många krisländer. Men i början av april spräckte ekonomistudenten Thomas Herndon tesen. Han stoppade in Harvard-ekonomernas siffror i ett Excel-dokument och konstaterade att de inte höll. Slutsatserna som professorerna hade dragit berodde till stora delar på ett räknefel. Och den historiska kopplingen mellan skuldsättning och tillväxt är inte alls så stor som Rogoffs och Reinhart hävdat. Thomas Herndons avslöjande gjorde dem till en världskändis och hans supportrar menar att han avslöjat den största makroekonomiska lögnen i modern tid.
So this is quite a story, isn't it?
It is. Thank you very much. It's been quite the experience. Certainly I never imagined it for a moment.
That it would have this kind of impact.
Yeah.
To me, the impact of it is quite interesting because it says, I think, quite a lot about the power of economics today, right? So you have this theory by these, two so respected figures in economics, and you have politicians all over the world citing this to legitimate a certain kind of policies. And then when you come out and you show that it's based on a mistake, Reinhart and Rogoff, their defense is that yes, we've made a mistake in our spreadsheets, but we can't be sort of kept responsible for austerity policies. We're just economists. What do you think about that defense?
I think it's probably an overstatement to blame them exclusively for the austerity policies, but certainly they had a role in promoting them, and their research was certainly cited very well, or highly cited by politicians the world over in the media. However, even if their paper had never come around, I still have the feeling that the politicians and a lot in the media would still be advocating these policies, and so. While it's an overstatement to blame them exclusively, I still think they probably have some tough questions to ask themselves.
So you don't think that economics is, because in my view, economics is maybe the language that we take most seriously in today's world. As soon as a politician starts speaking like this or citing economic papers, the public, they just we back down and we say, okay, they have science on their side. So you don't think economics is used in this way?
I do think part of economics is used in that way, or at least how the ideas of economics as a science, and especially the social process by which certain ideas are granted scientific status, are used in that way. I mean, economics as a field, there's a lot of ideas in it, and there are certainly a lot of critics of austerity policies and economics for really good reasons. Some of them quite prominent. They oppose the policies even at great cost to themselves. But there's some type of kind of a a social process where certain ideas like austerity policies have been granted scientific status both by the media or politicians, and certainly by some in the profession as well. And I think that process it's a really interesting process because, like I said, there were certainly critics of it, but they tended to be dismissed. Austerity was kind of it was seen as only every serious person would see it as obviously the solution, even though...
Certainly that way in Sweden, yes. And then that's how the crisis was interpreted, and that has and that had effects, in reality. So what is the relationship between, we read in the media, we read about Greek children starving and, pensioners committing suicide. Is there any relationship between that and, the spreadsheets of economists like Reinhart, and not just them, but the profession? Do economists bear any responsibility for these kind of things?
Yeah, well, I think it'd be an overstatement, of course, to blame the profession exclusively, but it'd also be an overstatement to absolve them of any responsibility. And I think right now economics is kind of going through perhaps a soul-searching process, and certainly some are engaging in it more than others, and we certainly have a lot of questions to ask ourselves. But then again, the critiques of it were out there. And I think one of the main effects of our paper is it was kind of an emperor had no clothes moment that caused a lot of helped to contribute to and facilitate a discussion that critically re-examined these. And then a lot of the voices that had been, rightly criticizing these policies were then taken more seriously. And I think that's really important because all too often a very small set of ideas within, the large field of economics are kind of granted scientific status and kind of canonized in the larger discussion. And I think that's really problematic because oftentimes the policies are really controversial and the good critiques of them really did exist as well.
And that's a political process, isn't it? The free market theory, the theory about the invisible hand, that markets can just be sort of left to themselves. So that's something that, we hear a lot about all the time, and it certainly has this almost scientific status. But if you go to the source, to Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations, he only mentions the invisible hand once. But today it sounds like that is, the biggest thing in economics. It's quite interesting what gets picked out. And have you given any thought to that?
Oh, certainly. It's something I've thought quite a bit because, there's been a lot of criticisms of that type of view, or a lot of examining of the limitations of the invisible hand leading, all the selfish actions of society to an optimal outcome. One of my professors has kind of coined the term the invisible foot for when self-interested behavior leads to suboptimal outcomes, or when people...
So what would that be, for example?
There could be a lot of examples of that. He tends to focus on kind of problems with incomplete contracts and just limits where, just typical ideas that even my grandma would understand, that when selfish behavior leads to bad outcomes. And I think a lot of the criticisms, they could be taken more seriously. And I think a lot of it, too, is the common wisdom as presented by members of the business press, especially, that kind of take these free market ideas as gospel or almost a theology. People joke about market fundamentalism. If we actually look at Adam Smith, he was actually very critical of this process. He said that legislation by business leaders should be given the utmost scrutiny because it almost always is... it promotes their interests at the expense of the larger public.
So what you're saying is that philosophers or economists like Adam Smith, they have been used for political purposes. Isn't that, couldn't you say that that's what happened to Reinhart and Rogoff as well? That, they came out with this paper and then politicians like George Osborne or Anders Borg here in Sweden used them for their political purposes?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. A lot of papers in economics are written, but it was a social process that kind of gave this paper canonical status. And certainly they had a role in promoting their paper as well. However, economists could try to promote their papers until they're blue in the face and still not be taken seriously. There's more of a social process that kind of put it on a pedestal.
economics be neutral? Or economists, should they be neutral?
So economics, it's a really fascinating study because there's both top-rate technical questions as well as very serious moral and political questions. And kind of navigating the balance between those is very difficult. The textbook typically says that there's positive economics, which is the study of what is, and normative economics, which is the study of what ought to be. But oftentimes, in practice, the line gets very blurry. So, for example, in our paper, there was certainly serious statistical analysis and top-rate questions, and to a large extent, we really tried to keep our politics out of just the dry statistical analysis.
But you were accused of politicizing, right?
True, and certainly, I would say my politics, it played a role in critically examining the policies, but once, we really sat down to do the analysis, it was very dry statistics. I presented our paper in front of a group of mathematicians and physicists last week, and they kind of commented that it was one of the least political papers they had ever read. My dad even said he could only understand perhaps 10% of it because it was all numbers.
But isn't that part of the problem with economics, that someone like your dad can't understand, he can only understand 10% of it? Because you have economics, which is so powerful, politicians use it, and the public don't understand it. It took you, you're a brilliant, mathematician to sort of to strip down sort of Reinhart and Rogoffs' paper and see these mistakes. I mean, a normal, person of the public could never do that. Isn't that part of the power that economics has over us, that it's become so complicated that no one can strip it of that and see this is the political bias?
It is really difficult, and studying economics, it's certainly, there's so many technical questions that can seem mind-boggling. But I do think that economic ideas can be communicated in ways that are accessible to a broad variety of people. I think a lot of it is the problem with how it's communicated. Academics have never really been famous for concisely and accessibly communicating their ideas. Some have been better than others. And so there needs to be much more of I think there needs to be improvements in the social process by which we communicate, and I think the media has a large role in that. And a lot of it, I think, is selective interpretations of the field by the media and what ideas are kind of taken as gospel. And I think it's very problematic that we don't have more popular discussion of economics in accessible ways because the central principle of a democracy is that policies that affect people, they should have a say in, to the extent that they're affected. And to the extent that we kind of confine economics to a purely technical discussion or the realm of technocrats exclusively, it's kind of anti-democratic because it excludes large amounts of people from the discussion. And I do think there are ways to communicate the ideas more sensibly, though, it's very, very difficult. I think the internet has actually improved the communication a lot. There are a lot of really good sites out there in the blogosphere and in other different alternative media sites where I think really good discussions happen that are a bit more technical. No, or not. Sorry, a bit less technical, more accessible.
Do you think we listen too much to economists? I mean, maybe politicians should employ sociologists or anthropologists, or But it's for the last 15, 20 years, it's only been economists.
I wouldn't suggest that we listen any less, but that perhaps we're more proportionate in the influence. And I certainly agree that the other social sciences have really important insights to convey. I think one of the problems with the way science and objectivity is kind of used in popular discourse, it's not always used to describe honest and solid research, but it's used more as kind of a club to beat the other side over the head with.
Exactly.
And there are extremely valid insights in sociology and anthropology and the other social sciences that are kind of dismissed as being not rigorous analysis. And I think that's a serious mistake. So instead of saying to listen less to people. I think we should broaden the conversation and allow more voices.
Listen to more people.
Yeah, we need more listening.
More listening. But because I find it quite interesting how sort of economists, someone like John Maynard Keynes, he predicted that in the future we don't care about economists or economics that much because we would have solved the economic problem and it would not be such a big part of our our life. But quite the opposite has happened, right? In the 90s, when suddenly people like Alan Greenspan of the Fed became big heroes, and even in popular culture, and it's been economics became sexy in a way that maybe I find a bit problematic.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned Keynes. He kind of had the idea that economists should be humble public servants, kind of like dentists. But this goes back to kind of a problem that Smith talked about in the theory of moral sentiments as well, that one of the problems with kind of our culture is, I think it, he described that the most consistent corruption of our moral sentiments was by elevating the rich and people who are very successful in markets to a very high status, and to worship them in some ways is kind of a fetishism. And I think, that's kind of, it's almost implied by a lot of the theories that we use in economics. If, free markets reward people proportional to their contribution to society, then, the folks that have done really well in markets are seen as heroes, while, the average person of modest means or is looked upon with it's looked with scorn. I think that's the word. I think that's a problem. It's interesting that you also mentioned that economists like Keynes and also, say, Schumpeter, even the conservatives, writing in the 30s, they thought economic growth would more or less solve the problem of providing for all. Keynes, in the very famous The Economic Possibilities of Our Grandchildren, he started thinking of what would we do once we have enough food, housing, and medicine and education for the populace? It would free people's time up so that they could develop their human potentialities.
Exactly, and think about other things than money and economics, and that is quite the opposite has happened.
Yeah, I agree. I think the overall cultural milieu or ideology of the last 20 years that I kind of have the image of Gordon Gekko, that greed is good.
Yes.
I think it's very problematic. It elevates some of what I consider, and, what my grandma would consider to be the baser elements of kind of human nature as kind of moral ends in themselves. And I think,
But has economics then been the science of greed is good? There are even studies saying that people who study economics are more selfish than the general population because they are attracted to this science of greed.
There's certainly strong currents within economics that could be interpreted that way. And I do think a lot of sometimes the simple presentations in the way economics is taught tend to convey that message as well. But economics is a very broad field, and, it contains a lot of critics as well. And I think one of the problems, again, is what's considered serious research or objective in the public discourse tends to marginalize the critics. They're seen as thinking too much with their hearts and too little with their brains. However, I think that's a serious mistake.
Yeah. And you proved that actually Reinhart and Rogoff needed to think a little bit more with their brains, right? Because they made this mistake. So.
Perhaps be just a little more careful with their calculations.
Yeah, exactly. Which is proofreading, which is a brain thing, I'd say. But hasn't economics failed in a rather spectacular way? If you compare, during the 90s when, Ben Bernanke talked about, the Great Moderation, or, Gordon Brown, Finance Minister of the UK, said that this is the end of boom and bust. And the implication was, or the idea was that because we have this great science of economics, we are able to sort of make better policies, so we're not going to have these kind of crises in the future, and growth will just continue. And then what happened, right? Isn't that a spectacular failure? And doesn't sort of the public, don't they have a right to sort of demand some sort of responsibility from your profession?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. I think the mainstream message that was communicated to the public and supported a lot of the policies that allowed the financial institutions to do some of the malarkey that they did, it was certainly a spectacular failure. However, I would also say that there were many critics in economics who really saw it coming for the reasons it did, and it really shouldn't have been too much of a surprise to anyone. Like anyone with even who's taken a brief look at the history of financial markets knows that they're largely unstable when left to themselves. One could just read Charles Kindleberger's book, Manias, Panics, and Crashes, to have a very comprehensive overview of bubbles throughout history. And I think it goes back to what's considered rigorous and serious economics. For example, to take even within the mainstream, Raghu Rajan in 2005, basically, he saw the causes of the crisis, or at least the proximate causes, and very much tried to communicate it to the profession. He talked about the problematic incentives of the financial sector.
And no one wanted to hear it because people were making so much money, right?
That's certainly part of it. But more than that, he was ridiculed and actually laughed out of the conference. And I think that type of attitude is very much counter to the scientific spirit.
And it's also, this is a typical of economics. It's a macho thing, isn't it, I think, a bit?
Yes, certainly. Whenever I hear the words rigorous and very hard science, it's certainly a very gendered concept. And if you really look at the history of science as well, some of the first scientific societies in Britain, they very explicitly said that they were trying to build a masculine science. So part of that is in the air we breathe. And so that's one reason I would encourage people to listen more. I think it's a very powerful skill, and perhaps ridicule what they don't understand less.
And listen to the invisible foot, right?
Exactly. The visible foot, the invisible heart as well.
Invisible heart. But let's bring it back to austerity policy. So your paper came out, and many world leaders have to come out, and the finance minister of Britain, George Osborne, said that he will not change his policies because of this. And I think that's quite interesting. You sort of talked a little bit about that before. How is austerity policies really based on economics, or is it? Because to me it seems that it's such the story about debt and austerity is such a moral story. When Angela Merkel of Germany, gives a speech and she talks about even a housewife in Schwaben can understand the euro crisis. It's only about not overspending, and any economist knows that that's not really true. And there's something interesting there. Is it papers like Reinhart and Rogoffs and the science, or was it really this moral story that sort of drove austerity policies and made them so popular, even with the general population?
I think it's a mix of both. There was certainly a lot of kind of economic research that supported the policy, so there was quite a bit that critiqued them. But the moral story is very appealing. Like, if you look at the history of the word debt, it's been very much tied up with sin quite a bit. And I think, the stories I hear that it's the fault of individuals, who have just been wildly irresponsible. For me, that's not the most useful way to look at it. And I think, going back to Keynes, he had a good description. He's like, no, it's not a story of like the excesses and we're all terrible and immoral people. It's akin to having transmission trouble with your car. And looking at it from more of an engineering perspective, that there's just something broken. Money and debt play a certain role in our economy, and we should look at that outside of really the moral context. I think that serves to kind of place the blame too much on individuals and take the blame away from broken institutions.
But isn't this a moral story? But it's about different kind of moral. I think that it's certainly a story about the moral of bankers or the moral of... so isn't maybe the solution is to tell a different moral story that can be just as powerful, but your solution is more spreadsheets?
Not always more spreadsheets, but yeah, seriously, looking at institutions and the problems with the incentives in institutions. One of the problems is that in the financial sector, a lot of folks had a lot of incentives to do very destructive things that would benefit them to a large extent, but would increase systemic risk and things like that. And so, the thing is if we have good institutions, then regardless of whatever malarkey people try to do, the institutions should be able to handle that and channel that in different ways. And, you know, it's not always just looking at spreadsheets. Certainly quantitative analysis is indispensable, but it's also having a good feeling for history and the evolution of our institutions. You know, I think it was and could have been easily predicted that if, you know, we allowed these folks to have gross conflicts of interest, that, you know, bad outcomes would happen.
Yeah. So this austerity debate that, you know, your paper is very much a big part of, we've been sort of, I think, stuck in that, and it certainly is very important, but it's very, very polarized, is sort of austerity or not austerity, and but somehow I think there's something that we're missing, which is we have very little discussion about what's going to happen, you know, what kind of economy will we have after we come out of the crisis, what kind of recovery will we have. So, for example, in Britain, it's 1 in 4 jobs created this year has been in real estate agents. So it's really sort of blowing up a new housing bubble, and we talk very little about that and a lot about austerity, not austerity. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I don't think that the underlying root causes of the financial crises and also things like the large deviation or the large problems that have generated gross income inequalities and the like, I don't think any of those have really been adequately addressed. And the problems that generated all those bad outcomes in the institutions still remain. I think we really need to have a serious discussion about how we can shape the post-recession environment to kind of maintain full employment. And I think that those will take larger institutional changes and certainly changes in the way we organize political institutions as well as just economic ones. I think there's a much larger role for the public sector than has been previously acknowledged, especially in the U.S. Part of kind of the accepted objective science of economics is that the public sector is always inefficient, government never does anything well, and the private sector is always more efficient. And I think, you know, I don't really think...
And that needs to change.
Exactly. I think that's very problematic. And even within the field of economics, the arguments are very much more nuanced, and there's, like my professors always, talk about the invisible foot. Markets sometimes perform really badly, and there's a broad class of kind of goods and services and different things that the public sector can play a really key role in. And really, I think if we look back at the Great Depression as well, it was very interesting that economists from both left and right saw a much larger role for the public sector to help coordinate and kind of create an environment in which the private sector could perform optimal tasks. I think much of the message I see from the recent advances in economics is that the assumptions and the conditions under which markets provide or produce good outcomes are very limited, and they have to be embedded within social institutions.
Well, thank you very much, Thomas Herndon.
Thank you.
Tack för att ni har tittat. Det här är frågor som kommer fortsätta diskuteras här och på andra ställen, och vi ses snart igen.